war got real complicated in 1945. It used to be that we look collectively at the bodies of the dead in our war, our shared sacrifice, and we had purged, exhausted the energy of the conflict and the blood, in this case almost universally for quite some time, over the 20th century at least, of the young men who died in the trenches. Around about 1945, we found ourselves in a very uncomfortable situation where we got right up to the threshold and had this thing looking back at us called mutually assured destruction. And we had to start figuring out how to shift the boundary conditions of how we exercise that impulse,
Mm-hmm.
the impulse of fuck you, the impulse of punch you in the face or hit you with a rock.
Right.
I think there's a finding that it's very powerful. Like that's an embodiment of the Christ myth in a sense, right? I think I've said this on a previous conversation, I think with Jack Murphy, which was, for 2,000 years, we had a story where we were invited to live in a certain way. For the past 100 years, we've had a story where we have to figure out how to. We've got no choice.
Right.
And every day, how would I call it? The pit gets wider and deeper and closer to our toes.
Right.
In 1945, let's make it 1962, just Khrushchev and Kennedy could have plunged the world into nuclear abyss, just two guys. And all they had to do is not push the button. But every day in every way, we just get better and better at killing everybody, right. Which means we got to get better and better at not killing everybody. And that age-old 13.5 billion year habit of when push comes to shove, pushing and shoving, we have to actually figure out how to not do that. We have to actually learn how to anchor ourselves in that space of peace, to consistently and always, as individuals and as a collective, to make that choice to freely associate. And it's right there. It's just, I feel like we sort of, if we step back and just sort of look at it, we can tell that we're currently right now living in two worlds simultaneously. You can feel the energy of the Girardian conflict, the scarcity mentality that at any moment wants to just tear apart the whole story. Pardon me. And on the other hand, the other side, salvation.
But that's the question that I was, because the ambiguous part that I was alluding to is the idea that, well, yes, scarcity tends to be the occasion for the impulse to find a scapegoat to resolve the tension. If there's a famine, if there's a plague, if there's lack of resources, if there's a murder spree, whatever it is, something creates scarcity of life, scarcity of food, scarcity of existence, scarcity of order, scarcity of resources, scarcity of health, and that triggers this hunt for the scapegoat. So We're still trying that today, but my question is that some people would suggest, and there's a quote, I think it's Dostoevsky or someone that says basically that if we would resolve all scarcity issues, if we could resolve all material want, would human beings stop their conflict? And it's like, no, there's something about human beings that you could meet all their needs and they would still find ways to create eternal dramas. So that's my question is it really, I rack my mind about this all the time because I'm always on the hunt for things that could provide solutions for scarcity. And I think about, all right, let's find energy too cheap to meter that's abundant. What would that do to alleviate the social pressures to attack everybody based on collective identities and nations and bombings and all these things? Would that reduce it a little bit? And then what if we could have, cures for cancer and Alzheimer's and diabetes and all these terrible things that our people are stressed out about? They have this latent death anxiety and it bothers them knowing that people they love around them will have these afflictions that don't really seem to have any resolution or cure. Imagine we could just cure all of those different things in our lifetime. So we cure pollution, we cure energy scarcity, we cure diseases that have been afflicting and scaring us. Would we still have the same level of conflict, or would it reduce it?
That there is Jabba the Hutt, right? That's the thing where the thing that's actually the problem, which is the fear at your heart. Right. So to be the basis of your choice is fundamentally anchored in fear. And you try to solve that by endeavoring to extinguish scarcity in the outside. And you create a cornucopia of muchness. And you've actually not solved the problem even the least bit. You haven't stepped in. In fact, in many ways, you actually get more fearful in the core. And And there's another way, right? The other way is to sort of recognize that the only 0 to 1, the only real bit that flips, the only real change that could ever happen is at that basis of choice. How much are you able to have the basis of choice, the thing that is at the bottom of how it is you're coming into the choices that you're making? How much are you able to achieve coming into that place from the space of love or peace or grace, whatever term you'd like to use? And they're all part of the same complex that can't really be named, or fear or sin, right? That's it. Because, and we have plenty of stories of people who've been able to make that shift. And if you come from that place of love and you perceive a possibility of material scarcity, real scarcity, the way you relate to that real scarcity is just completely different. Contrary-wise, if you come from a place of fear and you're sitting in a world of absolute plenitude, you're still an asshole. You can't help it. Greed will still drive a lot of your choice making. So the question is, how deeply can you ground yourself in that other place? And it doesn't mean for the least bit you're going to get rid of the aspect of reality that is bounded by thermodynamics. And that's still a fundamental characteristic of reality. What it means is that your choice making will not be dominated by that characteristic of reality. Your choice making will first and foremost be coming from this other location. And it will be, now we're back to the loaves and fishes. Right? As a parable, your choice making will always be saying, let us think more deeply. Let us consider more fully how it is we may find a way to achieve abundance in this space if we can maintain the capacity to not be at each other's throats. Now, we're 13.6 billion years into this game. We've got a lot of instincts that are oriented towards scarcity. It'll probably be another 13.6 billion years before we can be so fully anchored in the other side of that equation that we can feel like it's a real forever all the time. But there's definitely a sort of a 50-50. How often are your choices coming from one place to the other? How aware are you of what's the basis of your choice? To what degree are you unconsciously acting at a scarcity? And to what degree are you able to say, oh, shit, sorry about that. I just made a choice out of this place. How well can you come back into this new basis? How well can you recover when you get kind of knocked off your path? Can you say, oh, I'm off the path. And before I do anything else, because if I'm off the path, most of my choices are probably going to create harm. Before I do anything, how do I get back on the path? How do I, the 12 steps? How do I, can't remember what the third step is, but it's somewhere in the direction of how do I atone for the trespasses that I've made against others while I've been unconscious, while I've been off the path. That's just skillfulness, right? It's not that different in some sense from learning how to juggle. Not easy, but you can do it. And once you've done it, it doesn't mean you're perfect. It doesn't mean like if you're juggling and somebody comes and shoves you that you're not going to drop the balls. But it does mean that you can do something. There's a skillfulness and the capacity to orient yourself towards this basis of choice anchored in grace and love. Become more and more capable of staying in that place and knowing when you're out of it and always knowing how to come back to it. And then, of course, in that place, everyone who has that skillfulness has a capacity to be in relationship with everyone else who has that skillfulness that is oriented towards generativity. And that is the basis of true plenitude. And I think this is the real conflict, the real competition. There's a competition between the instincts that is oriented towards scarcity, which is to say, well, first and foremost, I want to be the boss. And I want to make everybody else be my crony. You remember something called the rules for rulers?
Oh, go ahead. What's that?
It's a really good case study of the logic of scarcity and how important, how fearful a dictator must be of the people who are directly underneath them. Because, of course, no human can ever rule a tribe of people. At the end of the day, each of us are just one person. It's only people allowing themselves to be ruled. And they allow themselves to be ruled in a series of surrendering their sovereignty. And so if you're the boss, you're the boss by virtue of the 5 to 10 people who directly are underneath you, right? The people right underneath you who are your enforcers and perhaps your operators and your organizers. Each one of them looks at each other as a rival, right? It's rivalry at the top more so than anything else. But if you're good at what you do, you can use the rules for rulers and keep things hanging together and maintain yourself and your cabal as being at the top of the scarcity pyramid. And of course, you want to make absolutely certain that everybody at the bottom of the scarcity pyramid is also making a local game theoretic choice to not pull together with anybody else at the bottom of that pyramid, lest you be overthrown. And so that's the game. Right? The game on that side of the equation, the game based on the basis of fear, is that game. Right? How do I maintain myself and my cabal at the top of the scarcity pyramid? And how do I manage that pyramid by through hook or by crook? Right? I can lie, I can bribe. Think about how Saudi Arabia manages its population. Right? It's got a small cabal of people who are aristocrats on top, and they got lots of resources. So they just make sure that they make the people fear violence enough and seek violence little enough that they stay a well-managed herd. Right? They stay in the cattle zone of humans, and then and the pyramid maintains. Right, that's one structure, and of course it's a structure that we've seen for a long time.
That's the domain of the sacred you just described. The idea, that's the domain of the sacred, that sacred violence staves off profane violence, right? And so
that's the second. The second one is where sacred violence staves off profane violence. Right. The first one is fear of profane violence maintains a tacit agreement to stay in the profane. And a big piece of the profane is to simulate and also to parasitize the sacred. Think about the movie Star Wars. You ready? I'm going to go straight 1970s kid for you. Old George Lucas did a terrible and horrible and wonderful thing at the same time. He tapped into Joseph Campbell, and he crafted a parable tapping into our mythopoetic sacred, right? The deep roots of sacred, which every child who watched that movie is like, oh, okay, that, my instincts that have been born through a lot of countless generations trying to sense what is right and what is wrong. That story resonates with it. And by the way, when I look around me watching Saturday morning cartoons and TV commercials, I don't see much of it. So even though it's a thin gruel of mythopoetic sacredness, it's more than nothing. And then he proceeded, and with the good help of the folks at Disney, even more so, to strip mine the sacred as maximally as possible to feed the Jabba the Hutt character in the profane and make us lose sight of the difference between the sacred and the profane. But there is a difference, right? And the other side is the sacred violence. The other side is the not rules for rulers, voluntary association. We've got a goddamn term for it. People actually recognizing that to come together entirely voluntarily, out of wisdom, out of a felt sense of the reality of community, that we are in fact all part of the brotherhood of man. It is inevitable and has always been thus. We are family in a deep sense. And I don't mean that artificially. I mean that really, to actually do it. And, going back to homesteading, you get 10 strangers and you have them build something together and have them live or die by the virtues of their own hands. And 9 of them will actually become family. Typically, one of them will still be kind of an asshole. Not necessarily, but you got to keep your eye out for that one. Because that's part of the story as well. Right? So I think that we can continue to tap on that distinction between the sacred and the profane, the distinction between the fear-based scarcity mentality, not scarcity itself, but the mentality that is using fear to maintain its, if one of us is going to starve, it's going to be you. And the state of grace of being in the abundance mentality, which says, well, neither of us needs to starve if we work together.